Please welcome Reverend Eileen Brownell.
Good morning. It's always wonderful to be here with you. Talk about surrender. I wasn't quite sure if I was going to be able to make it. On Friday, I went to Reno for a wedding. And if any of you saw my Facebook page, you noted that I ended up taking 8 hours, and I found a new purpose for my 7-iron, and that was to scrape my window of the ice. So it was a little bit of a challenge making it to there. How many of you have heard of Charlie Blondin, B-O-L-O-N-D-I-N? Any of you heard of Charlie Blondin? Well, I can't say as I'm surprised, because he was born in 1824 and died in 1897. However, Charlie probably has the greatest reputation as a tightrope walker of anybody in the world. And in 1860, he strung 11,000 feet of cable that was 2 inches in diameter across the Niagara Falls and chose to walk it. Now you have to understand that they had to stretch extra cables to hold the cable in place because it would sag in place, and of course if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, the power of the water, the wind, etc. But he walked that cable. And one of the things that he did is the first time he just got out with his 12-foot pole that he did, and he walked straight across this 2-inch cable. And the next time that he got out and walked across the cable, he put a sack over his head so that he couldn't see. And he walked across the cable. And of course, everybody was cheering and raving him on. They were so glad to see him do this. The third time he did it, he got on a pair of stilts and he walked. Oh, it gets better. It gets better. And the fourth time he did it, he rode across the cable on a bicycle that was specially built to fit in the cable. The fifth time he did it, he put a blindfold on him so that he definitely could not see down. And the sixth time that he did it, he carried a little stove out, stuck it on the cable, balanced it, fried an egg, ate it, and then went back, carrying the stove and his eating implements. Now, the seventh time that he went out, he took a wheelbarrow and he loaded it with potatoes. And he went out across the cable pushing the wheelbarrow. The eighth time he did it, he went out with one of those old-fashioned box cameras, you know, that sits on the cable or sits on the tripod that you put over the screen over your head or the material over your head. And he went out and he balanced the camera there and he stuck the material over his head and he took a picture of the crowd that was back on the edge waiting for him to arrive. And he did that. And then when he got back, he looked at everybody and he said, "Would anybody like to volunteer?" And all these hands shot up. "Yes, yes, we'll volunteer." And he said, do you believe that I can actually carry somebody across on the cable with me?" Everybody goes, "We believe! We believe!" They were so enthused. And then he said, "Who'd like to go with me?" And of course, nobody volunteered to go with him. And so he ended up carrying his manager across on the cable. Now, what we know is that nobody was willing to surrender to Charlie Blondin. Nobody was willing to let him have control of their life for even just a few minutes, to walk across 11,000 feet, which is just under a quarter of a mile, across the Niagara Falls. And what we know by this is that at some point in our life, we must all surrender, just like I had no choice. I was stuck in a snowstorm and there was nothing I could do. Gary Zukav tells us, who is the author of The Seat of the Soul, says, "Take your hands off the steering wheel Be able to say to the universe, "Thy will be done," and allow your life to go into the hands of the universe completely. Marianne Williams says in her book, A Return to Love, surrender means the decision to stop fighting the world and to start loving it instead. It's a gentle liberation from the pain, and to relax, to feel the love in your heart and keep to that as your focus in every situation in your life. That's the true meaning of spiritual surrender. I think that spiritual surrender is an awakening and an awareness that our mind and our ego are not the highest power in the universe. Let me repeat that. Spiritual surrender is an awakening, an awareness that our mind and our ego are not the highest power in the universe. When we spiritually surrender, we let go of all the struggles in our lives and we tap into the greatest source, the biggest source in the world or in the universe, which is the divine. We tap into love. Many years ago, I was the manager, a community services manager at a city in Orange County. And I got to tell you that I loved being a park and recreation professional. I loved doing human services kinds of things and being of service to other people. But I got to tell you, I detested my boss. See, he was a short little guy that kind of had a Napoleon complex, and on top of that, he was having an affair with a woman that worked for me. In addition to that, every time that I would give her a directive as her direct supervisor, if she didn't want to do it, she'd run to Ron and she'd say, "I don't want to do this," and he'd call me into his office and say, "Judy's not doing this." Then on top of that, he had a tendency to exaggerate the truth. He would tell city council one thing, and if the public wanted to hear another, he'd tell that to them, and then he'd tell a third thing to the commissioners, and finally he'd get around to staff and he'd tell us an even further different story. And what you got to know is that everything about Ron I found abhorring. He was having an affair, and yet he was a man that was married with 2 children. This was totally against my morals and my values. I detested this man. And one day I attended a conference, and it was for administrators in parks and recreation, and there was a woman there that facilitated the program all day. Little did I realize, because it was long before I went into religious science, that she was a religious scientist and happened to be a practitioner. And so I made an appointment at that point to go see and spend a couple of hours with her individually when I was in the Bay Area a few weeks later. And she told me 2 books that I needed to read. One of them I can't remember, but the second one was A Course in Miracles. Isn't that interesting? And then she told me that the most important thing that I needed to do was to forgive my boss. Forgive my boss? He was a liar? He was an adulterer? How could I possibly forgive this man? But she pointed out to me that until I forgave him, until I got into that position and surrendered by forgiving, that things were not going to get any better. And so she gave me this little mantra to say, and it was something like, "I forgive you, Ron, for all that you have done. I forgive myself for having these thoughts." And sometimes I'd get into a meeting with Ron and I would sit there and I would do it probably 10, 15, 20 times within an hour. I was forgiving this man for what I perceived to be the lies that he was telling. About 6 months later, I got called into his office for him to do my evaluation, and it was kind of like, okay, here we go again. I'm going to get put down. I'm just an average employee as far as Ron's concerned. And he took about the first 10 or 15 minutes and said, "I don't know what you've done. I don't know how you've done it. And I really don't care. But I want you to know you're a joy to work with now." And then proceeded to do my evaluation that was all outstandings and exceeds expectations. Something had happened within me, not within him. All of this had transpired because I made the choice to let go and to surrender to the challenge that I perceived and the things that I thought he should be doing. You see, surrender can spur us on to action. The Buddhists call it compassionate action, and it means working with rather than against. For years, I had struggled with this boss, and when I chose to work with him, regardless of what his values were, regardless of his behavior, something shifted and happened. All of my challenges ended. In her book, Let Go, Let Miracles Happen, by Kathy Cordova, she suggests that there are 4 major steps to surrender. They are letting go, surrendering a problem, going with the flow, and surrendering to love. Let's look at each one of those today, because I think that each one of those is important to that step of spiritual surrender. The first of letting go. Now, as long as we wish for things to change, guess what? They're not going to change. We have to be willing to surrender what isn't working in our lives in order for the change to occur. As a police chaplain, I often do ride-alongs, and oftentimes, especially on Friday and Saturday night, we are called into domestic violence situations where we're talking to 2 people, 2 individuals. And what's always interesting to me is whether it's a battered wife or a battered husband, whether it's a battered woman or a battered man, and we try to convince them that let's take you to a shelter, let us get you out of here. Guess what? They never ever want to leave. I think it's because of fear. I think it's because they fear the unknown and fear that what they're going to is worse than what they have now. Also, letting go means getting to a place of acceptance and forgiveness. We don't have to forgive the act, but we do need to forgive the person. Remember, one of the key elements of my process in terms of letting go was forgiving Ron. And acceptance means letting go of our expectations of how we think things should be, and moving to a place of appreciation. There have been many studies that have been conducted on forgiveness, and of course what they always find out when they look at people who have walked that journey of forgiveness is that they have less stress, less heart disease, and less emotional challenges within their life. So why should we let someone else hurt us because we refuse to live or to forgive and let go? That's like wishing somebody dead and we take the poison and drink it. We need to forgive. The key to letting go is that whatever we are holding on to most tightly, most closest to our chest, right in here that we want to have exactly, is to let it go. Whatever you're most afraid of losing may just be exactly the thing that you need to let go. Remember, when we let go of something, we are making room for something new to come into our life. Next, we must surrender a problem. That means turning our challenges over to the higher power. For others, it still might be that moment of bargaining. God, if you just give this to me, if you'll just do it, I'll be in church every Sunday for the rest of my life. Well, we all know how that works. There is real power in surrendering our problems to God, and especially through prayer. And it means not asking for a specific solution, but rather being willing to let Spirit guide and give us the answer. Martin Luther King Jr. always cites how he surrendered during the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. Now, for 11 months, Martin Luther King helped to organize the folks there in Montgomery, Alabama, into carpools. And so they would carpool their people each and every day to their jobs, to their doctor's appointments. They would assist them in getting where they needed to go so that they didn't, have to ride the buses. And so at this point, after about 11 months, this was really devastating the city of Montgomery. because financially the city depended upon those city buses to bring money into the city coffers. And so out of total and complete frustration, the mayor within Montgomery, Alabama made a decision. He was going to create a law that stopped all carpools. He was going to create a law that would prevent anything that would assist these folks from getting to and from where they needed to go, and that they were going to be dependent upon the buses, or else they would have to walk everywhere. Martin Luther King was really uncomfortable with what was transpiring, and he waited a period of time before he took this to the folks that were involved in the boycott. And the night before the big hearing that was to transpire, he called them all together, and they sat down and they prayed. They didn't pray for the boycott to end or for what was transpiring. They didn't pray that the carpool would continue to be. They just prayed that there would be a solution to this situation. And the next night they went into the meeting, and as it was going along, it was not looking good at all. Remember, this was Montgomery, Alabama in the 1960s. And so at some point they called for a recess, and Martin Luther King and all of his supporters stepped outside, and within a few minutes a reporter walked over to him and said, "Have you heard? Have you seen this?" And the reporter handed him an article, and it said, "The United States Supreme Court today unanimously ruled bus segregation unconstitutional in Montgomery, Alabama." What would have happened if they had only prayed to keep the carpools going? They didn't tell God what to do. God always has a better way to solve our problems if we're willing to let go and then accept and act on the answer that we're given. Next, we need to go with the flow. We've all had struggles, and sometimes they are there because we're swimming against the current. You ever done that? Swim against the tide, and you end up in some place that you never thought you were going to be? I look at the challenges that I had with Ron and realize that truly I was swimming against the current. And as soon as I began to go with the flow, by releasing my belief in the struggles that were at hand, life became a lot easier. It may sound crazy, especially with our control-oriented mind. Most of us want to have control of what's right there in front of our lives. And yet we wear ourselves out, keeping our heads down, determined to get where we think it is best for us to go, and best for others to go likewise. We paddle and we kick as hard as we possibly can to get there, and worst yet, so we end up someplace that we didn't want to be. We wear ourselves out with resisting change, and we resist what is really not working for us. Oprah Winfrey, when she was initially starting her career in life, really saw herself as a television reporter. That's what she wanted to do, was to be a TV reporter and then ultimately move up where she would be sitting behind the desk, every night at 5 o'clock news, reporting what was going on locally. And then from the local, she was going to make it all the way to the big time, to one of the major stations. But one of the things that happened for Oprah is as she went out, she was so sympathetic and so compassionate and so loving towards the people that were there that when they were in tragedy, she began to cry, and she's reporting with the microphone in her hand. She started to cry. She couldn't bear to hear the stories that these people were telling her, and she became emotionally involved in them. And so the news director just kind of tried to talk her through and said, "You can't do this. You have to be logical. You have to be tough. You got to stand up to this." And he kept sending her out, and she kept going out and crying, being more compassionate. And so it wasn't working. And on top of that, he didn't like her hair. He really didn't like her hair, and he didn't like her makeup, and so he decided that at television department's expense, he was going to send her out to have a complete and total makeover. One of the things that happened, however, is they put some kind of substance on her hair, and it burned her hair and it started to fall out. Kind of tragic indeed, but he wasn't real happy with that either. And finally he called her into the office one day and he said, I have no choice but to demote you. I'm going to demote you. I'm going to put you at the early morning wake-up show where she sat and interviewed people and they got to tell their stories. And one of the things that Oprah says is that it was at that point that I knew I had found my niche. I was home. I knew where I needed to be. This was it. Now, can you imagine if she had tried to keep on being a reporter? We would have never known the things that we know today because Oprah brought it to us. The CEO of Valley Care, which is a huge major healthcare organization within the Bay Area, was originally a nurse's aide. Can you imagine? 25 years she went from a nurse's aide to a CEO of an organization. Pretty incredible. Quite something for a new humble beginning. Marcy Fiat credits her success, however, to a few simple things that she did each and every day that she walked into work. She showed up each day and she asked 3 questions. What do I have to do? What are the problems and how can I solve them? And how can I work to make things better? Marcy went with her intuition on all of these. She said, if it didn't feel right in my gut, I didn't do it. And she avoided allowing her logical mind to step in and stayed with what was transpiring within. She knew that she was being led each and every time she got the answers to those questions by the divine. And she furthermore released all fear, and life unfolded for her perfectly. Amazing things happen when we let go of the need to control the outcome and simply go with the flow. Last, we need to surrender to love. So often in our life we create barriers to what love is. We forget to see love in each and every situation and then to return it back to the universe. Sometimes we just don't understand how we can possibly find love in any given situation. Stan absolutely adored his wife, Rosemary. She was tiny and she was beautiful. She always dressed so elegantly, and they shared so much in life. Ultimately, she was diagnosed with cancer, and it was a vicious form of cancer, one that robbed her of her dignity and of her ability to control her elimination process. And it was a difficult thing for Stan to watch her. And as the disease progressed and took over her body more and more and more, she would cry out in pain at night, begging him to take her to the bathroom. And the medical staff showed him exactly what to do so that neither one of them would get hurt. And so he would go over and he would bend down to her and she would put her hands around his neck and he would rise up and lift her up and then he would pick up her frail body and take her into the bathroom. Something that was losing dignity for both of them. It seemed to be the most horrific part of their cancer journey. And then one night when he went over and she screamed and he went over to pick her up, he looked at her and he said, "Shall we dance?" And she looked at him with those eyes of love and said yes. And he said in that moment, there was a complete and total shift. It was as if we were on a dance floor, waltzing together to imaginary music. And he said our nightly visits from that point on became a symphony and a dance for us to move from the bed to the bathroom. It took a place of something that was degrading, that was awful, that was challenging, and turned it into a thing of love. A love for both of them. He said instead it brought even deeper love into this very difficult situation. Sometimes we can only see hopelessness, sadness, grief, or tragedy in a given situation. It is our task, however, to seek out only love and peace. And when we do, we receive it back tenfold. In every instance, no matter how hopeless or how helpless or sad we feel, love can transform any situation. It can take darkness and make it into light. And whenever I am challenged by a situation and have dug my heels in not wanting to let go of what I think is right, what I think is the best answer, I remember the greatest and most powerful story of surrender of all. The night before Jesus died, he went to the place of the olives, Gethsemane, and said, "Father, if you will let this cup pass from me, but not as my will, but your will be done." He surrendered and let go of what he wanted and tapped into something far greater than himself. And so often we think our will, our way, and what I want is right. We cling to it. We try so hard to impose what we think is right on others as well as on ourselves. And yet, so soon we discover that when we let go, surrender the problem, go with the flow, and let life, or surrender all to that which is love, life becomes more joy-filled and so much easier. This is the truth in my life, and this is the truth in yours, and so it is.